Okay. So the first thing I'd like to do is just give Don a chance to talk a little bit about where this... What I think we can all agree, this wild idea for a piece of historical research came from. It seems not just sort of ambitious. It seems it seems beyond ambitious to take something on like this, and the kind of thing that until you know more about the actual nature of the research involved may even seem a little bit crazy. So, where did the idea to do this come from, and what do you want to say about it? I mean, it's been a very long, ongoing project. And a lot has happened in your life over the course of this project. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So the motivations behind the project go back to when I was a kid. When I remember learning in primary in the South Bend ward when I was 10 years old about the lost pages, and somewhere I've got a little coloring book we put together of like sheets on like the different presidents of the church. And when we learned about Joseph Smith, there were these pictures showing Joseph lending Martin Harris the pages and so on, and they told the story of the lost pages. And I remember thinking, we're missing part of the Book of Mormon? Like, what was in it? Because the Book of Mormon is so foundational to the faith, if you're growing up Latter-day Saint, that it just seems almost inconceivable that part of it would just be gone and nobody talks about what was in it. And so actual real work on the project started about 15 years ago. And that had to do actually with research that I was doing on the Book of Mormon text that we have, where one of the many sort of avenues of research that I was pursuing was looking at the sort of literary features of the text, where our narrator here, Mormon, is building his narrative. He's sometimes echoing earlier parts of his narrative. It's like there are themes and there are messages that he wants to play out across this narration. And what I came to realize is the book is self-referential. It's got intertextuality between different parts of itself. And that'd be intratextuality, or what would that? So he's always alluding back to, always echoing his earlier texts. And what I realized is, if I'm missing the first part of his narrative, I can't actually understand what he's saying in the later part of his narrative. So,
so for clarity's sake, then one thing we have to first thing we can say, which is not exactly not common knowledge, but just so we get it out there, these lost pages, which you argue in the book are probably more than 116. These lost pages are the portion of the narrative represented by the first two books of Nephi, Jacob, Amos, Jerem, and Omni. But the portion of that narrative, the way that Mormon would have redacted and presented it and summarized it based on Lehi's plates, rather than Nephi's own first-person account. So we're talking about the plates of Nephi as edited and redacted and presented by Mormon. Right. So this is what you mean when you say there's a part of Mormon's text that's missing.
Right. So in the preface to the 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith explains the missing text. And he actually has to explain the missing text. This isn't really optional. And the reason is, if you look at the Book of Mormon's title page, it says, the Book of Mormon, written by the hand of Mormon, so on and so forth. Without a preface or any other introductory material in there to explain the manuscript loss, readers, those very first readers, right, who have no one to explain the book to them or anything, would turn the page, and there would be a narrative, I, Nephi. Who? What? Like who's Nephi? Where did Mormon go? And so Joseph Smith adds a preface, and he puts it between the title page and the beginning of 1 Nephi, so that readers find out that as he explains it, the original book really had been Mormon's book. It was the Book of Mormon. That was supposed to be what the bulk of it, if not all of it, was going to be, according to his understanding. And Mormon, he said that the lost pages were the first part of Mormon's abridgment. Now, because we have the name which he provided, saying it contained the Book of Lehi, that's made people misunderstand, actually, the scope of what was missing. So Joseph explains in the preface, section 10 of the Doctrine and Covenants explains that the lost manuscript was replaced by the small plates of Nephi. So that means the narrative from Lehi, as it says in section 10, all the way down to King Benjamin. Okay, so Omni and the Words of Mormon take the narrative up to the early reign of Benjamin. They're replacing the original account, Mormon's narration, from Lehi to King Benjamin. So if you look at chronologies that people have created, the LDS Scripture Committee, the people who did the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, that means that the missing manuscript would have covered about 450, 460 years. So unless Lehi lived a really long time, it's more than Lehi. So if you look at the total length of Mormon's abridgment, like what chronology he covers from Lehi, so about 600 BC, then down to 320 AD is when Ammoron, the last author of 4th Nephi, leaves off his narrative. And so Mormon picks up then in his own lifetime a little bit later than that. So his abridgment of the earlier records covered from 600 BC to 320 AD. That's 920 years. And what are we missing? 454 or 460. What's half of 920? 460. We're missing the first half of Mormon's abridgment. So take any lengthy, complex narrative, War and Peace, right? Rip out the first half, okay? Have somebody give you a sort of vague thumbnail sketch of the first half and then launch into the second half and see if it makes as much sense. Try reading it the other way and see, which way does this make more sense, right? We've got a problem when it comes to understanding the part of the Book of Mormon that we have, because we're missing much of what was supposed to be there to go with it. And so that is really the recognizing that, and that Mormon was always alluding back to his earlier narrative. And so you can't really fully understand his later narrative without knowing a whole lot about his earlier narrative, is what prompted me to start gathering information.
Now I'm going to bring up a bit of a personal factoid from your biography here, because I think it's interesting in the context of both how this project began and how long how long it's been coming to fruition. And that's that bracketing the very, very beginning with the coloring books as a child. You spent a good deal of time as an adult essentially outside of the church, not a believer, basically an atheist. And it was during this time that the project actually had its inception, not just as a curiosity, but as something you actually wanted to work on. And you continued to work on it when you underwent another transition. You reconverted to Mormonism, you were rebaptized, and became a believer again. Right. And so you've approached this project both from the perspective, not only have you approached the project from the perspective of a non-believer and a believer, but the project had its inception at a time when you weren't a believer. Right. So do you want to talk about that at all? Yeah.
So like I said, the actual project started 15 years ago. At that point, I had not left the church, but I'd stopped believing. I was going through a period where I kind of bounced back and forth in terms of my beliefs somewhat, but on the whole, I really didn't believe during that time. It was maybe about a year or so after I started this project that I I formally left the church. I had my name removed from the records. At that point, I had become an atheist. I think when I started this, I might have been like a sort of hopeful agnostic, became an atheist. I spent 5 years outside the church, almost exactly 5 years. And then it was actually in part, it was really two intertwining projects, one of which was this, in the Lost Pages, that caused me to really reassess my direction and come back to the church. I was rebaptized 9.5 years ago.
Very cool, very cool. And I think it says something implicitly, but I think important about this project, which is that this is neither a believing nor an unbelieving book, right? This is the approaches, the methodological approaches that you take to the book, the reconstructive and interpretive and analytical approaches that you take to the book are not grounded in a sort of stated or even implicit position that the book is either ancient or modern. Right. What we know for certain is that there was an actual manuscript. Right. There were actually these pages, however many there were actually these pages. Joseph and Martin really did produce a manuscript that told a story. And that manuscript we don't have, and that manuscript is related to this manuscript that we do have. Right. And it turns out it is possible, without fully recovering the actual manuscript, to know some things about what it contained, and in particular about how it's different from what we have. Yeah.
So an analogy that I like to use is to textual criticism. So textual criticism is actually a discipline that's closely related to what I'm doing here. So for instance, well, let me say it this way. This is not the first time that someone has attempted to reconstruct a missing text. When people are skeptical about the possibility of reconstructing missing text, one thing that they show from that is what they don't know about disciplines like textual criticism. So in biblical studies, there are a few missing texts that scholars try to reconstruct. And there's a distinction there in how they do that I'll talk about in just a minute.
Like the Q Gospel, for example.
Right. So the Gospel of Q. So this is there are three of the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, they're called, that tell basically the same story. They
Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
The same core story. Mark is pretty clearly the earliest of those. Matthew and Luke both use Mark as the narrative bedrock that they build on.
They're responding to him as well.
Right. And then Matthew and Luke also contain a common core of material that's not in Mark. So scholars have noted this for a good while, and they've posited, well, therefore, there's some common source that Matthew and Luke have that Mark doesn't have.
And they have certain things in common. They have certain things in common, like almost all of the material that Matthew and Luke have in common with each other that they don't have in common with Mark are sayings of Jesus, quotations that are attributed to him.
Right.
Not stories, but specifically sayings.
Yeah, and I came to hear John Dominic Crossan sitting right here a couple years ago talking about this kind of thing, So, for the purposes of... So what a textual critic does, is they try to establish what the earliest text was and how the text changed over time. And one of the things they are trying to establish here is what was in this missing Gospel of Q. Now that's a relatively more straightforward problem than the one that I'm dealing with, because they can kind of look at what material do Matthew and Luke have in common that is not in Mark. And then they'll identify that as Q, right? And so they have the actual sort of whole text, or most of it, to work with. The Lost Pages of the Book of Mormon provide us with a an even more difficult problem. But regarding questions of like faith or non-faith, in looking at this, the analogy that I like to use is two textual critics can be talking about the gospel resurrection narratives. Let's say the resurrection narrative or narratives at the end of the Gospel of Mark. And there's actually a lot of controversy about the ending of Mark and how much was originally there about Christ's resurrection. But you could theoretically have an evangelical Southern Baptist textual critic, right, who's committed to figuring out what that earliest resurrection text in Mark was. And you could have an atheist, Richard Dawkins reader, right, who is undertaking the same project, who's also a textual critic. And in theory, they should be able to agree on what that original ending of Mark was and what it said about Christ's resurrection. Because the question that textual criticism tries to get at it's not a question behind the text. It's what was the earliest text, right? So textual criticism is not trying to get at, was Jesus resurrected? Textual criticism is trying to get at, what was the earliest narrative about Jesus being resurrected? That's what I'm trying to do in this book. So it really hasn't made much difference for me methodologically being in the church or out of the church, because in this project, I'm not trying to get behind the lost manuscript. I'm not trying to go, dig somewhere and find the bones of the Nephites or whatever, right? I'm trying to get not behind the lost manuscript. I'm trying to get at the lost manuscript.
And there are non-religious contexts for this as well. I mean, you have Homer's epics. We know of two of them, but we know there are known unknowns. Right. We know that there are lost epic poems that Homer wrote, and that other important classical authors wrote, and we know something about some of these texts, even though they're non-extant. We don't actually have the text.
Exactly.
There are references to them in other texts. There are references to them made in some of Homer's other works. There are references made to them by contemporaneous scholars, by subsequent scholars, and so you can know something about the text even if you don't have it.
Yeah. Yes. So one of my very best friends in the world, Trevor Luke, is a classics professor at Florida State. He talks with me about the reconstructing portions of the Greek epic cycle, the Homerian cycle. And there are various clues to it, but then, those clues are used to infer the parts that we're missing. Similarly, I had a professor in my graduate work at Utah State, Mark Damon, a professor of ancient theater, and what he has primarily done in his academic work is try to reconstruct missing Greek plays or portions of Greek plays. And there are methods for doing this. You sometimes have descriptions of certain parts of the plays by other people. You have maybe a part of the play from which you can infer some about missing parts. You have other plays, sometimes by the same playwright. You have the fact that the playwright tends to copy elements of his plot from earlier playwrights, or that he tends to be echoed by later playwrights. And so you look at the people he tends to echo, or the people who tend to echo him, and that can give you a sense of what's going on there. You've got similar methodology that can be used with the Book of Mormon. So if we didn't have any of Mormon's narration, it'd be a whole lot more difficult to reconstruct, portions of, any of it. But since we have part of the narration, sometimes there are narrative flashbacks where he mentions an event that we're apparently supposed to be familiar with. In Alma 10, verse 2, you've got mention of Aminadai who interpreted the writing on the wall of the temple. What in the world is he talking about? This is referred to as if it's something familiar. In Mosiah 11, you've got King Noah builds a tower on the hill that was north of the land Shiloh, and this detail is dropped in that it was the same hill that had been used as a resort by the children of Nephi at the time they fled out of the land. Now, you guys remember the time the children of Nephi fled out of the land, right? Because I don't. Like, it's not in our Book of Mormon text, but Mormon thought it would be familiar to us. Well, how can he, when he knows that he's our only source for information on this, the only way he can assume we would know this is if he's already said it. Then we have the fact, for instance, that a Book of Mormon narrative tends to be built on a kind of biblical typology. This has been talked about in some places a lot. So that the theme of Exodus in the Book of Mormon, whenever people are journeying somewhere, it's not just a journey in the Book of Mormon, it's an Exodus. And especially with Lehi and Nephi and their families leaving Jerusalem, there are very heavy echoes of the Exodus in the events, in the word choices. And so knowing that Book of Mormon narrative tends to be built on this sort of biblical typology gives us the same kind of framework that, Professor Damon was using to reconstruct elements of Greek plays, because he's looking at what are the antecedent narratives whose structure is being copied. And so we also have there actually methods for reconstructing missing texts have been in place since at least the 1700s, where Chinese scholars have attempted to reconstruct what was known as the Great Yongle Encyclopedia from various clues. For the lost pages of the Book of Mormon, we have a whole slate of different clues. We have the fact that I've already mentioned that the small plates, not the seal plates, the small plates of Nephi replace the lost manuscript. They give a thumbnail sketch. They give a skeletal narrative of that same time period. Well, you can do a lot with a skeletal narrative, right? You take other clues and then add some flesh to those bones, right? Flesh out this narrative further. We've got clues from some of the early revelations. Section 10 of the Doctrine and Covenants is explicit at one point, telling Joseph, you remember that it said in those pages, such and such, right? Two of the other earlier revelations actually had phrasing in them. Previously, one had a whole paragraph that was removed when the revelations were published, that I argue actually has really weird stuff that was removed. And what's weird about it is, you look at it and you're kind of like, what's it talking about? Well, again, the original recipients of these revelations apparently knew what it was talking about because it was material from the lost pages. But knowing that readers of the Doctrine and Covenants weren't going to know what was in the lost pages, they removed those elements. You've also got a couple accounts of statements made by Joseph Smith about things from the lost pages. We've got an extensive, beautiful interview with Joseph Smith Sr. that's really the backbone of my reconstruction of a couple or maybe three narratives in this book. We've got beyond that, we've got statements from people who knew Martin Harris very well. One that stands out is an account given at a state conference on April 6th, 1856 by Emer Harris. So Emer Harris is Martin's brother. He's also a direct ancestor of Dallin Harris Oakes, if you didn't know what the H stands for. Emer Harris said some things about the length of the missing manuscript, and what he gave was more than 116 pages. And he said some things explicitly to people at this conference about what was in the pages. Not a lot, but some about the Mulekites and how they escaped from the Babylonian invasion. He said, I think his words were, I will now tell you some of the things that were lost. And then he launches into this bit about the Mulekites. That must have been really cool to be there. But I basically tripped over this at the church archives. I was looking for something else, and it was in meeting minutes of the state conference. So there are just a bunch of sources. And so first step in this process, really, for me 15 years ago, was to look for what had been written on the subject, The only thing substantive really was a chapter in a book by John Tvetnos, who recently passed away, where he gathered some of the Book of Mormon's internal clues that I'm talking about, like the Eminadi, the hill north of Shiloh, and so on. Then I looked at what other clues could I identify, and it's sort of like gathering puzzle pieces. Suppose you've got a 5,000-piece picture puzzle, and, some disaster happens, a tornado, right? Most of them blow away, but you've got some fraction of them left. Maybe you are able to pull together 750 pieces. So how much can you tell of what was in that picture, that original picture? You're not going to see all of it, but you piece together enough of those, and you're going to be able to see sort of what it's a picture of, infer maybe in some of the gaps what was there. That's really, I think, an excellent analogy for what I do here.
One of my favorite little pieces of, call it speculative poetry, comes from a book by Harold Bloom called The Book of J.
Yeah.
He's a big fan of the Yahwist in the Old Testament narrative, the Hebrew Bible. And for those who aren't familiar with textual criticism, one of the when it comes to the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible, one of the basic sort of orthodoxies is that there are four different sources. It's a priestly source that's referred to as the P source, and there's the Elohist, and there's the J source. So the Elohist is the E source, there's the J source, which is the Yahwist, and then there's the Deuteronomist. And so you have those sources. And the creation narrative is actually a splicing together of two of those sources. Genesis 1 comes from the priestly source. And then Genesis 2 and 3, which discuss the Garden of Eden and the creation of Adam and Eve, and the whole Eden story. That's a Yahwist source. And so there are two totally different creation accounts that come from different sources that are sort of stitched together in the book that we have. Well, Bloom isn't a fan of the priestly source, but he's a big fan of the Yahwist. He thinks the Yahwist is one of the greatest writers that humanity has ever produced. And what he does, one of the things that he does in his book, I mean, he does a beautiful translation of all of the Yahwist sources, all of the Yahwist texts in the Hebrew Bible with commentary, but he tries to reproduce what he thinks Genesis 1 as a Yahwist text would look like. In other words, the primordial creation of the earth out of nothing. And to do that, he looks at other places in other Yahwist texts that mention the creation. To try to kind of speculatively piece together a short creation narrative. And what he puts together, I mean, it's admittedly speculative, but it's, and he actually, unlike Don, he actually tries to sort of produce something, acknowledging that it's speculative, that it's creative. He tries to actually produce an actual text. And it's quite something. It's really, it's quite amazing. So, speaking of somebody who found the Book of Mormon text and Mormonism quite engaging without being a believer, do you want to talk more about methodology, or do you want to maybe shift into talking a little bit about some of the things that you've concluded in the book, some of the actual analysis that you've done?
So why don't we go to conclusions in the book? If people have further questions about methodology, we could address those later.
Okay. So there are a couple of things I would like to bring up here, but there's a very big picture conclusion that you've drawn here. I mean, there's almost 200 pages worth of you sort of reconstructing different stories, different narrative elements.
Okay. So actually, it may be helpful to know that the book is in two parts. So part one, I would call the history of the lost pages. Part two, I would call the history in the lost pages. So that's the missing stories, what we can reconstruct of those. In part one, what part one has to do with the lost pages is I try to tell the story of their emergence. I talk about the translation, who were the scribes. So, for instance, Emma Smith, the evidence is, was Joseph's first scribe. So originally it's like husband and wife working on this book together. And then I have an extensive chapter about the theft where I analyze the various sources on that, suggest who may have been involved, and critique a common explanation of the theft. I have a couple chapters before those that's sort of laying the groundwork for that, retelling the familiar story of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon in an unfamiliar way with new elements. And that helps to provide themes and information, things from the Hebrew Bible that are going to be significant to understanding both what comes later in part 1 and what comes in part 2. So the reconstruction part of the missing stories that we're about to talk about, that's part 2 of the book.
So I'm gonna tease that reconstruction a little bit by giving a bit of a spoiler on early section of the book, which is what you just described. You describe how in the book you depict the emergence of the Book of Mormon, the recovery of the plates, the visions, the translation, etc. And in particular, those initial contacts and the first discovery of the plates. You depict this story in terms that draws heavy analogies with the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah.
And this is going to set the stage for talking about the reconstruction of some of the other stories and some key themes in the actual missing text. But you draw parallels, I think significant parallels. Not only were there early accounts that literally described the box that the plates were in as an ark,
right,
but there are some fascinating kind of parallels here. I mean, on the one hand, there's a kind of inversion of materials, right? You've got the ark was the Ark of the Covenant was a gold box with stone tablets in it. This is a stone box with gold tablets in it. Mm-hmm. You've got the interesting sort of calendar stuff. It's essentially around Yom Kippur, around the Day of Atonement, that Joseph is given access. To this ark with these plates in it, and this is the Day of Atonement is the day that the high priest in Israel, in the Holy of Holies, was able to actually access the contents of the Ark of the Covenant. And also interesting parallels between what Joseph Smith is attempting to do in sort of recovering an ancient text, recovering a lost text that's going to help institute crucial religious, sort of transformative religious reforms, and what Josiah did in the biblical narrative. And with Josiah, it involved discovering lost text, or discovering an ancient scriptural source, in this case, something that was more closely connected to the book of Deuteronomy. But tablets that were originally in the Ark of the Covenant, and then based on the discovery of those tablets, implementing really significant, really transformative reforms. And so you're situating the discovery of the Book of Mormon in a very Josian, a very Deuteronomistic, and a very Israelite sort of idiom, and connecting it with these stories, and in particular with the Ark of the Covenant. And that's going to help provide a context for one of the, I think, most important overall conclusions that you draw about the text itself.
Yeah. So what's the question?
That's sort of pitching for you to talk about what one of these key overarching insights about the total, like what is one of the, in the broadest possible terms, what is one of the key differences between the missing pages in the narrative that we have now?
Sure. So, yeah, at the conclusion to the book, fittingly, was one of the things that I wrote last. And I actually was surprised. I had initially not planned on writing a conclusion to the book. The narrative actually ends at such a great point, right? The actual Lost Pages narrative, that I just kind of thought I could leave it there. And then I was thinking of writing a conclusion, but I thought it would just be like 3 pages. And then I actually wrote it, and I can't remember, it's 18 pages or something. But it just flowed out. It was one of the easiest parts of the book to write because I've been wrestling with this Lost Pages material for a decade and a half, and there were all kinds of larger conclusions that had gelled in my mind based on all these details that just naturally came out. And fittingly but accidentally for a book that talks about sort of how Hebraic the Book of Mormon was, there are 7 of these conclusions. And one of the big conclusions that I lay out near the beginning of the conclusion to the book is that the Book of Mormon's lost text was very, very Judaic. It was more Judaic than the extant text that we have. But that also made me, mining what we could know about the Lost Pages also made me see how Judaic the Book of Mormon as a whole is. So, for instance, as Brad mentioned, we see this, we see it in both the Book of Mormon's emergence, in that part 1 of the book, and then we see it in the Book of Mormon's content, particularly the content of the Lost Pages, how Judaic it is. So in the book's emergence, you have, as I'm telling the early part of that story, Joseph going to the hill on September 22nd, 1827, to recover the plates. Joseph going back 10 days later. Well, he gets the plates out of their protective ark. He takes them and he hides them in the hollow of a tree. 10 days later is the second event in the book's emergence. Joseph goes and retrieves those plates and brings them home and reunites them with the Nephite interpreters, or Urim and Thummim, that he'd already brought home. 4 days later, he, according to his mother, he looks into the interpreters to find out who's supposed to help him. He starts actually using these relics that he found, and he's shown that, Martin Harris is supposed to help, and Martin's supposed to undertake a journey, taking the characters back to the learned. And then, a number of days later, after a sort of period of testing, Joseph and Emma are able to take the plates out of harm's way, out of range of the people who are trying to steal them, and get them down to Harmony, Pennsylvania, where they'll be safe. Each of those 4 events that I just described, each of them is absolutely, documentably, from the early sources, keyed to a Jewish festival. So the day that Joseph goes and gets the plates from their stone ark is Rosh Hashanah. It's the Feast of Trumpets. It's a kind of New Year celebration. It also celebrates the giving of the law on the stone tablets, which, sort of going up onto a hill to get gold tablets might sort of be a parallel there. And you've got, so 10 days later, we're told, is when, this next event happens. And that is the Day of Atonement. On that day, Joseph is bringing, he's already brought the interpreters that parallel the biblical high priest Urim and Thummim home. Then he brings the tablets home with them. 4 days. So yeah, that's Day of Atonement, which is when the high priest was able to actually access the ark, and he's wearing the breastplate and the Urim and Thummim, and he's wearing a gold plate, an engraved gold plate, actually. The one engraved gold plate of the entire Bible, he wears it for this. And then, 4 days later, these dates are all as spelled out in the Bible for what the festival dates were supposed to be. 4 days later is the beginning of the Feast of Tabernacles. that commemorates the Israelite wandering in the wilderness at the Exodus. And that's when Joseph looks in the interpreters and sees that Martin Harris is supposed to undertake this journey with the characters, right? So that actually ends the Jewish festival season for, I believe, for the whole year. It certainly ends the fall festival season. So I mentioned, though, that even that last event of taking the plates down to Harmony was key to festival dates of the Jewish calendar. So if you realize that the first day that Joseph goes to the hill, September 22nd of that year, was the beginning of the Feast of Trumpets that celebrates the giving of the law to Moses on the stone tablets on Sinai. How long, according to the Hebrew Bible, was Moses up on Sinai getting the law? 40 days. Okay? We have an account from Martin Harris that identifies the exact day that Joseph takes the gold tablets out of harm's way. And if you count, it's 40 days from the day he got them. It's November 1st. And 40 days in the Bible is a significant time period for a lot of things, right? It's a period of testing. For instance, Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. So Joseph and his family endure this period of testing, right, where there are all these people trying to get the plates and they have to protect them. Once they've done that for 40 days, they're able to escape from that situation. They've passed the test, right? How much more Hebraic could the emergence of the Book of Mormon possibly be? And like I say, he's translating it with so he gets all these things from an ark. Martin Harris calls that stone box an ark. As Brad mentioned, it inverts the pattern of the biblical ark, which was stone tablets in a gold box. And here we've got gold tablets in a stone box, right? To start the translation of them, he's using, these two stones that attach to a breastplate, which Mormons recognized really early on was familiar. So they started calling those interpreters the Urim and Thummim after the biblical stones that do the same thing and attach to the high priest breastplate, so on and so forth. There are other elements, right, that line up with the sort of Judaic Ark of the Covenant, high priestly Jewish festival context. And then you get into the book's actual contents. And here's something that to me is just amazing. It's kind of mind-blowing. The Book of Mormon, it seems to me like there's just so much about this book that just never really understood, or maybe, so much that's there for us to discover. So if you look at when the Book of Mormon starts, when the Book of Mormon narrative starts, Nephi tells us this in the extant text in 1 Nephi chapter 1, verse 4. What he tells us, he uses phrasing that's so familiar that we have no idea what it means. We don't actually think about it because it's so familiar. And how many times have you read 1 Nephi? Right? So we just sort of gloss over this part. He says, came to pass in the commencement of the first year of the reign of Zedekiah, king of Judah. Now, this sounds like a random chronological marker, in the 19th year of the reign of the judges, and so on, right? Not so.
It's the commencement.
This is the commencement of the year. This is the commencement of the Book of Mormon's narrative. Why is that significant? Well, how did Zedekiah get put on the throne? The Bible tells us this is all against the backdrop of the biblical narrative. The Book of Mormon starts in the Bible. It's starting here in the time of Jeremiah, time of Zedekiah. And the way that Zedekiah comes onto the throne is that the previous king, Jehoiachin, is deposed by the Babylonian emperor. Nebuchadnezzar II or his armies lay siege to Jerusalem. The elders of Jerusalem decide they're going to just hand over the king because they don't want the whole city destroyed. So they hand over the king. Babylonian emperor puts another member of the same family on the throne. That's Zedekiah. So when the Book of Mormon tells us that it was in the commencement of the first year of the reign of Zedekiah that Lehi has this vision, what that actually means is, right after the Babylonians came in and kicked butt, right, and got rid of the previous king, they also deported many of the notables of the city. This is the beginning of what will become known as the Jewish exile, or diaspora, which actually has shaped Jewish life ever since. The word Jew originally comes from Judea. These are people who are named after a place, their original homeland. And ever since the Babylonian exile, there's never again been a time, even after the return from the exile, when all Jews lived in Judea. It never happened. So a feature of Jewish life for 2,600 years begins to be established at this point. Soon, several years later, the Babylonian emperor will return, and this time he will not just accept taking the king. He destroys the city, destroys the temple, right? Ends the Davidic monarchy, deports the people. So the Jews, what do they lose in the exile? They lose almost all the features of the Jewish Commonwealth. They lose their biblical promised land. They lose their sacred city. They lose the Temple of Solomon, the first temple. They lose the Ark of the Covenant and its sacred relics that were in that temple. They lose the sacred Davidic monarchy. So what do Lehi's people lose when they take off into the wilderness in anticipation of this all happening? Well, they lose their promised land. They lose the biblical promised land. They lose the sacred city, Jerusalem. They lose Solomon's temple. They lose the Ark of the Covenant and the relics there that represent the presence of God. And they lose the Davidic monarchy. So what do they do when they get to their new promised land? Well, they replace it all. First, by claiming this new land as a promised land. To them, they're not going to treat this as an exile. They treat it as an exodus instead. They're not going on an exodus from the promised land, as far as they're concerned. They're on an exodus to the promised land. They replace the promised land. They build a new temple city, which is first the city of Nephi. They build a temple that they say explicitly is patterned on Solomon's temple. They piece together a collection of relics that closely parallels, in almost shocking ways, the relics that were in the biblical Ark of the Covenant and possessed by the Ark's custodian, the high priest. They construct a new sacred dynasty on the model of David's dynasty, right down to, how does David begin his rise to kingship? Well, he kills Goliath, right? He cuts off the guy's head with his own sword. How's Nephi? What are the first hints that he's going to rule over his brothers? Well, it's his response to the whole brass plates incident. He cuts off Laban's head with his own sword and keeps the sword. That's the same thing that happens in the Bible.
There are even parallels in the verbiage there.
There actually.
How Nephi describes seeing Laban's sword, right, and the hilt and everything.
And there are a number of elements of the story that are presented in the exact same order as they are in 1 Samuel, the story of Goliath.
And one of the things that, one of the points that emerges that you're talking about here is that, yes, you see these Exodus themes, and you see these Davidic themes in Nephi's own account of himself, and his account of his own, leaving Jerusalem. It's not an exile; it's an exodus, right? Where he's a Mosaic figure and he's a Davidic figure. But one of the things that you argue that sort of gets downplayed in Nephi's telling of the story, but is much more conspicuously present in the 116 pages in the Lost Book is the Passover context of this. That it's not just that it's an Exodus, but the original Exodus begins with the Passover.
Right. Yes. So I mentioned earlier that one of our best sources, my favorite of the sources that I draw on in this book, is an interview that Joseph Smith Sr. gave early in 1830 to a Palmyra area neighbor, Fayette Latham. So Latham is a young man. He's heard the buzz about this forthcoming book, but it's still at press. He can't actually read it for himself. So he does what I would have done. He goes to the Smith home and he talks to Joseph Smith Sr. And Joseph Sr. tells him in detail the story of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. And he gives details that we can verify from other sources that were not published at the time that Lapham publishes his account. And Joseph Smith Sr. also tells him the narrative that was in the Book of Mormon. But then, funny thing, as he's telling that story, he's got lots of familiar elements, right, about Lehi being warned to leave the land, sending his posterity back to get this record, and so on. The record's possessor is lying drunk in the street. The son cuts off this guy's head with his own sword, and so on. But he throws in details in these narratives, and sometimes whole narratives, that aren't in our extant Book of Mormon text in the small plates, but that would fit just beautifully, hand in glove, right? They would make more sense of the narrative. And so an example of this is that Joseph Smith Sr. tells Fayette Lapham that the reason that Laban was drunk is because there was a great feast going on in the city of Jerusalem at that time. So that really got me thinking, and I started looking for clues to what feast it might have been. First of all, I was seeing clues that actually that like really fits. So, for instance, Laban's not just drunk. Laban's drunk, and he's been out by night with the elders of the Jews. This guy's really high-profile drinking buddies if he's going out carousing, right? He also goes out carousing in armor and carries a sword, for what that's worth, right? So he appears to be in sort of maybe ceremonial dress. Well, certain Jewish festivals have days that are known as holy convocations. These are communal celebration events. You don't just go get a sacrifice, and you don't just go celebrate at home. You have group celebrations. The first and last days of Passover are holy convocations like this. And so there are a number of clues. This comprises much of my chapter 7. There are a number of clues in the Book of Mormon text that we have that really strongly identify, well, first of all, confirm a festival context, and then really help to identify it as Passover. And then once we see, I give one example, one of several. The Spirit, when he commands Nephi to kill Laban, uses language that's very much biblical language and should be familiar for readers of the Bible. And that language is that it's better that one man should perish than that a nation should perish. This is Caiaphas in the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John explicitly says Caiaphas was acting as the high priest and prophesied this. So the Gospel presents it as a legitimate prophecy. And the context is Passover. And actually, the nature of Caiaphas' prophecy is that it relates to Passover. What Caiaphas probably would have seen the connection being is the firstborn among the Egyptians had to perish so that the incipient nation of Israel, fleeing from Egypt, would not have to perish.
And the Paschal Lamb would have to perish.
But the way that Christians read this is not the way Caiaphas would have read his same prophecy. It's the Passover Lamb has to perish in order for the people, the firstborn of the Israelites, to not perish. And so that very strange use of biblical language about Jesus for Laban, who's not exactly a good equivalent to Jesus, actually makes much more sense when we place the whole incident in the context of Passover. And then doing that is seeing this Passover setting for the very beginning of the Book of Mormon really has implications for understanding what happens in the text after that and what happens in the book as a whole. So Lehi has his calling vision right before this, and so I argue that it was early in the Passover month of Nisan or Aviv. Shortly afterward, Lehi is teaching his sons. He's expounding the very things that were in his vision. In 1 Nephi chapter 10, he revisits things that he said about his vision in chapter 1, and he expounds them. And one of the things he expounds is that the Messiah would be the Lamb of God. Oh, Lamb of God. Where do Christians get the imagery of Christ as the Lamb of God? Well, it's because in the New Testament, Christ is our Passover. He's our Passover lamb. And so Lehi's teaching about the Messiah, his revelation about the Messiah, makes a lot more sense suddenly in the context of Passover when it was first given. Notice that the people of Jerusalem in 1 Nephi 1 respond really, really badly to Lehi prophesying the Messiah and the redemption of the world. That doesn't sound like bad news, right? But they want to kill him. So if he's prophesying a Messiah who will not be a conqueror, not be a temporal deliverer, but who will sacrifice himself like a lamb, that's maybe not the Messiah that they want.
They just lost their king to an invader.
Right. This is not welcome news. Especially in that context.
The immediate context. We just had our king deposed by an outsider. Now you're saying the Messiah is not going to restore that?
Right. The Messiah is going to come and let himself be killed. There you go. So we talk about the Book of Mormon as another testament of Jesus Christ. That's been added as a subtitle for the book. But if you actually just open up the book to its beginning and you start reading, most explicitly and specifically, it's the story of this guy Lehi and his family and how he gets saved from being destroyed at the destruction of Jerusalem. Except, if you then take that and you put it in this original Passover context, where you have a typology of deliverance, then the Book of Mormon, that narrative is not just a story about one man's temporal deliverance. It's a story of the deliverance of humankind by the Messianic Lamb of God. So these extra details really help. They have implications for the book as a whole, for really understanding what it's about, what its messages are, what's going on there.
I think we should do some Q&A. If anybody's got questions. I mean, I've got questions too, but I've been sort of monopolizing Don. So who has questions?
I'll just go ahead and get it started. I have 1,000 questions myself, but and to the idea of reconstructing text, it made me think of King Kong, the famous the spider scene that was lost, and they attempted to reconstruct it in one of the later King Kongs a few years back. Cool. So this happens not just in books and in literature, but we even see it in pop culture now.
Well, George Lucas's original intentions for the second Star Wars trilogy, where there may have been like a Darth Jar Jar figure. Fascinating.
Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out. But my question is, you put a lot of stuff in the book, so I want to ask something that doesn't necessarily have to do with what's inside the book, and that is, what can you give us a morsel or two of something amazing or some sort of interesting morsel that didn't make it into the book because it wasn't quite on topic? But, I know that when you're researching these things, you amass all of this data and knowledge and insight, but you have to drop a lot of it out, right? Because it doesn't fit the theme or the structure of the book. Could you perhaps give us regale us with one or two, like, really powerful things, maybe, that didn't make it into the book that we would,
Sure. Yes. Okay. So much of what didn't make it into the book, and I have intentions for future publications for all this good material. But much of what didn't make it into the book were things that were early on in the book, because a lot of what I was doing. Actually, let me take one more step back to explain this. So, I recently saw something else published in a chapter in an online book by a capable Latter-day Saints scholar, Brant Gardner. And in this chapter, Brant actually tries to look at what are some of the evidences for what was in the last 116 pages. And so it looks, from what I've been able to read of it so far, I've been very busy, but it looks like it's mostly stuff that I've got in my book. But I noticed how different the approach was to presenting it, and that is, Brant's presentation of the evidence is in the form of a list. How did mine come out to be in the form of a narrative? I give an extended narrative, especially of Lehi and Nephi. Well, the reason is that as I started piecing together, gathering and then further piecing together the evidence for what was in the lost manuscript and started discovering some of the stories, what I found was eventually it clicked for me that over and over these narratives and details clustered around certain themes. They weren't unrelated. This wasn't random. This was very unified, and so particularly the story of Lehi and Nephi, as it was given, the fuller story, as it was given in this lost manuscript, almost all the clues that I could find about that were clustered around a sort of meta story that I've sort of laid out and sketched here a little bit earlier, and that is the Lehi and Nephi, they lose all the institutions of the biblical Commonwealth of Judah in the Old World. And so they go about systematically replacing those with parallel institutions of a Commonwealth of Joseph in the New World. Almost everything that I can find about them clusters around that. It all fits. It all pops into a larger structure, right? So there's a meta-narrative that we can tell of what's going on there. So much of what ended up being cut, some of it very directly is about things that are in the lost pages. Some of it, a lot of it is groundwork that I'm laying, because I decided early on that I wanted to structure this as a narrative, because that's how it naturally, that's what it was in the original, that's how it naturally should be. So I wanted to tell a narrative. So I told certain elements of the early narrative more fully, fleshing out kind of what they mean. This is the early elements of the Lehi and Nephi narrative, and how they echo the biblical text. And so I did that partly because it tells us some more about what was in the lost pages, but also, and because it fit these were elements that fit this larger meta-narrative in the book. And then also, because a lot of that helped to lay groundwork for arguments that I wanted to present later in the book. So most of what got removed is early elements where I'm really fleshing out the biblical context, and then some later arguments that depended on that content, but since for length reasons and other reasons, early stuff needed to be cut out. That limited, not much, but a little bit what I could tell later on. So, for instance, in the story of Mosiah the First, because I hadn't been able to adequately introduce certain themes and biblical connections. An example of those, I had a perfect one in mind just a second ago. Okay, so there are a lot of echoes in the extant Book of Mormon text, and in what we can piece together from the lost text. There are a lot of echoes in the story of Nephi and Laban, and Nephi and Laman and Lemuel, that echo, as we mentioned already, David and Goliath. there are also a lot that echo David and Saul. And seeing the way that the Book of Mormon narrative was dealing with Goliath, it was making Laban a parallel figure with Goliath. It was also making Laban a parallel figure with Saul, which I hadn't expected. And what I came to see from the way the Book of Mormon narrative uses this biblical material is that actually Goliath and Saul are parallel figures in the Bible. This had never occurred to me before. Okay? But David's rise to kingship begins with his conflict with Goliath, which is done on Saul's behalf. And then it ends with, David's rise to kingship really ends with the death of Saul, right, who dies in battle with the Philistines. And remember, Goliath is the Philistine challenger, right, against David. So there are details of those narratives, starting with Goliath. He's famously big, right? He's a giant. How tall was Saul? We usually don't think of that in terms of Saul, but the First Samuel says Saul was a head taller than any other man in Israel. He's a giant. Goliath and Saul are both giants. Okay? Their manner of their deaths is similar. Some of the details about their deaths, how they each ultimately die by their own sword, how they're each described as falling to the earth. It's like a parallel motif, right? There are a number of common elements there. So delving into the way that the Book of Mormon echoed the biblical narratives of Goliath and Saul and intertwined them keyed me into new readings of the Bible. The Book of Mormon is a fantastically complex reader of the Bible. And I actually put a little bit about that, not about these details, but a little bit about that idea in the conclusion of my book. And in some ways, as I put it there, in some ways it's like the Book of Mormon almost like out-Bibles the Bible, right? It takes themes from the Bible and it extends them further into a larger narrative. It goes further in the same direction. It strengthens sometimes things that are implicit in the Bible, sort of beefs them up or makes them more explicit. So in one way you could maybe say, although it's a tad nonsensical, the Book of Mormon is more biblical than the Bible, right? But what I would actually like to say is, not that the Book of Mormon is more biblical than the Bible, but that, in a sense, the Book of Mormon makes the Bible itself more biblical. The Book of Mormon fleshes out, it brings out certain readings of the Bible, it extends those. And so an example of this for me would be, reading of the David story and the roles that, Goliath plays at the beginning of that story of his rise to kingship, and Saul plays at the end of that rise to kingship. That reading it's clearly something that's there in the text. It's an intended meaning of the text. I never saw it till I started delving into the Book of Mormon deeply in the lost pages. Right?
Quick follow-up then. What would the implication for the sword of Laban then? It figures prominently throughout the Book of Mormon. What does that add to our understanding of the depth of the symbolism of the sword of Laban? Since you mentioned that Mosiah, it talks about Benjamin wielding the sword of Laban. You talked about how Saul and Goliath were both killed by their own sword.
Yeah.
And we know the famous vision where the sword is now lays unsheathed, right?
Yeah.
In the cave.
Right.
What's the destiny for the sword then? If the sword, if Saul and Goliath died by their own sword, and now the sword of Laban survives and is unsheathed, what's its destiny? What is this telling us?
So have you read the book, or is this
your book?
Yeah.
No, I haven't.
Okay.
Haven't read your book.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one thing that you're going to love my book.
We'll be buying your book.
No question about it. I mean, gosh, the trouble there is where to start. So I'll try to keep this brief because we've got other questions.
Absolutely.
But for one thing, you need to understand that the sword of Laban, it's a sacred relic in the text, right? It's one of the things that's described, at least in some accounts, as having been in that stone ark, and it's one of the relics that's handed down with the plates and the lihona and so on. It turns out that so I identified these in the book as Nephite temple relics specifically. Okay? That is on a model of the biblical temple relics. All those relics have parallels, some of which I'll leave for the book to explain to you.
Absolutely.
But one of them is, here's one that nobody would think. The sword of Laban parallels the sword of Goliath. Okay. So most obviously in how it's used to cut off its owner's head, right? By somebody who's going to found a dynasty. But the sword of Goliath doesn't end there in the biblical narrative. When in 1 Samuel, Saul is pursuing David, and David flees into the tabernacle, the temple at the time, he asks the high priest for a sword. And the high priest says, I've got a sword. The sword of Goliath is hanging on the wall behind the ephod. So the ephod is the high priest's garment that the breastplate and Urim and Thummim attached to. In other words, the sword of Goliath was a temple relic, passed down with the other temple relics. The high priest gives that sword to David to defend himself.
Can I just make a quick publisher's comment on this question? So what was removed out of the book during the editorial process, I just want to assure you that anything that was removed, we made sure was covered later in the small plates of Dawn.
Right. Which hopefully will not take another 15 years, right?
Yeah, right. There are also, I'll leave this for the book, but the sword, you're going to love this. The sword has a crucial place in what I call Nephi's conquest, and I name it Nephi's conquest based on the fact that the Nephite narrative is presenting a sort of echo of the biblical narrative of the conquest. The biblical conquest is carried out under the leadership of Joshua, with his sword being sort of its leading symbol. And chapter 10 picks up that narrative in the Book of Mormon. And I'll just say this. There's a source indicating that it's actually the same sword. That the sword of Joshua from the conquest, it's supposed to be the same sword that was handed down to Laban and becomes Nephi's sword. So then what does that portend for the future? I don't know, really fascinating, right? That you mentioned the cave story where the sword is first sheathed.
Right.
I believe it's initially hanging on the wall.
Hanging on the wall,
sheathed,
and then it's on top of the
which
plates
is like
or
the sword of
something.
Goliath hanging behind the ephod
in
the tabernacle, and then it's unsheathed. Yeah, so, yeah.
Wow.
I mean,
one thing that's always bothered me, and I'm not sure you're going to be able to help me with this, but having Lehi and Jeremiah hanging out roughly the same time, same place, right? And reading Lehi's work in the first part of First Nephi. It's so infused with Christianity. I mean, it's there.
Yeah.
And no matter how hard you try to, go into Jeremiah, you have to go dig pretty deeply to see 12 apostles, to see Mary, and the vision isn't there in that text. As you're talking about reading back from the Book of Mormon into the Bible, that's one place that I would argue it doesn't work. We can't really. I mean, you've got the Messiah. We can make the Messiah a Christian document or a Christian oratorio by pulling the text out of it, the Old Testament. But any Hebrew scholar will go, no, au contraire. That's not what this stuff meant, right? So I want to know how you take that. What was going on? And this is a kind of a theological question for you.
Sure.
But you don't need to answer it that way. Any way you want to answer. The two prophets, same place, same time, seem to have such radically different views of the Christian future about to come.
Sure. So, there are a few places we could go with that. One is that, I was mentioning earlier this Passover context. The Book of Mormon begins at Passover. Lehi's. In fact, if you go back to that first Nephi chapter 1 verse 4, that the Book of Mormon, Lehi's vision occurs in the commencement of the first year of the reign of Zedekiah, king of Judah. The Bible and the Babylonian Chronicle actually tell us when that was, and the Zedekiah's reign commenced around the beginning of the calendar year with the month of Nisan, or Aviv, which is the Passover month. Okay, so when you recognize that the Book of Mormon begins at Passover, and that Passover is the context for Lehi's initial revelation of the Messiah, then the fact that the Nephite conception of the Messiah is, from the start, the Lamb of God, it's not that the Book of Mormon is claiming that this was already understood at the time. This is already being taught by Jeremiah. It's that this is a new revelation to Lehi that once you put it in its Passover context, makes a lot more sense. And
the Nephi's obsessed with trying to understand his father's revelations and seems to be able to kind of uncover, discover, have more revealed about Christology and about the nature of the Messiah because he's so obsessed with his father's revelations. Yeah.
And Nephi's own vision that's echoing his father's visions has been described by one scholar analyzing it as a Paschal vision, a Passover vision. So based on its content, right? So one answer to the question would be that the Lehi's Passover revelation of the Messiah as the Lamb of God is a kind of point of departure of the Book of Mormon's theology from the theology of the Hebrew Bible.
Right. Whatever the state prior to that point, whatever the state of messianism or messianic movements in this sort of pre-exile or arguably early exile Jerusalem, that whatever Nephi saw or whatever Lehi saw in the desert made him into a kind of radical messianist who specifically saw a future Messiah through the lens of the Lamb of God, or the Paschal Lamb, the Lamb of God.
And you asked earlier, Brad, this ties in here, what some of the differences were between like the small plates narrative that we have and the lost narrative. So one, I don't develop this a ton, but I do talk about it. I actually want to pick this up as I flesh this material out further, is that there are sources, early sources, and there's evidence in the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants indicating that the lost manuscript was more Judaic, both in terms of developing Jewish kinds of themes, so for instance, exile and restoration, Jewish festival days, and so on, but also in the sense that the lost manuscript seemed to be more Hebrew Bible in flavor than New Testament in flavor. So the small plates actually seem to be the New Testament flavored version.
So it's Paul trying to teach the Jews about Christ.
Of a narrative. It's a sort of, in some ways, overlay of more New Testament sorts of themes onto a narrative that originally emphasized more Hebrew Bible themes, and that could, theologically, there's a lot of directions that could be gone with, well, why is that the case? So I actually think, based on a couple of things, that I think, first of all, I think that the lost manuscript talked about the Messiah all the time, so literally from the very beginning, this Passover vision and so on. But I have reason to doubt that it mentioned the name Jesus Christ explicitly the way it shows up in the small plates. And that,
where does it first show up in the small plates again? Calling him Jesus? Is it not till Jacob?
There's something that's a little funny there, because actually in the original manuscript of the small plates, Joseph Smith at one point uses the name Jesus Christ, but that name hasn't explicitly been revealed yet And so when he goes through and revises a subsequent edition, he changes it, I believe, to say the Messiah. So quite possibly this is kind of what's going on all along. It may be that the name Jesus Christ is actually being provided by Joseph Smith.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. We're just going to take a quick 1-minute break. We're not recording anymore, so we're okay. But we'll probably just field a couple more questions when Don gets back. Less parched, Don. Let's. You were in the middle of saying something, and then we'll take a couple more questions.
I think I was done, but what was I last saying?
Your last thing was how the New Testament.
Oh, we were talking about the name Jesus.
Yeah, that
and the sort of the language of Jesus Christ as opposed to the nameless Messiah.
Yeah, this actually fits. Randy, I think you are familiar with my master's thesis, as I recall, my master's thesis overlaps with this book in part, but. In the thesis, I developed more of what was going on at the time surrounding Joseph Smith as he's translating the lost pages, and how is this lost manuscript being understood on the ground at the time by Joseph Smith, by Martin Harris, by the people around them, and the evidence that I lay out there, which to some extent I've also put in this book, is that they understood the emerging book to be a book, in Martin Harris's words, to confirm the Old Testament, and in Joseph Smith's words, to bring in the Jews, to gather the Jews. And so the Jewish content of the Lost Pages, the Jewish framing of that narrative, also was connected with a surrounding Jewish context, a very Judaic way of understanding the text and what it's supposed to do. It's going to confirm the Hebrew Bible and it's going to gather the Jews.
So I remember as a teenager wondering where Nephi and Lehi kind of got their authority to make sacrifices in the temple. Or even when they're traveling, right, in the wilderness, they're doing sacrifices. Yeah. Do you cover that in the book? If you're talking about how they're following the law of Moses.
So it's a crucial question, actually, is since they say in the book over and over that they're trying to punctiliously follow the law of Moses, this is part of why it makes sense that they build a temple like Solomon's temple. They have an Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is not an optional feature for keeping the law of Moses. It's part of the Day of Atonement ritual that's crucial to the Torah. And so, I'm a little hoarse. How do they claim authority to perform sacrifices out in the wilderness and so on?
Without the lineage of Aaron.
Yeah. There are a few things that relate to this. So first, a lot of biblical scholars say now that prior to the Josian reform, the authority and ability to offer sacrifices was not just limited to the temple priesthood. And so it's argued that by Latter-day Saint scholars that the Nephites, Lehi and the Nephites just carry on an earlier pre-Josian reform Israelite tradition. The stuff that I found in my book lines up with that really well. Also, I discussed the nature of Nephite priesthood and show that this just sounds like so sort of so typical of how we read things in the church. I'm actually grounding it in the text. That's the difference, though. Like we tend to just guess a lot of things, but I argue that from the evidence of the text, we can see that the model for Nephite priesthood isn't the Levitical priesthood, it's the priesthood of Melchizedek, who was understood to be both king and priest at the same time. So the high priest among the Nephites isn't a descendant of Levi, it's the king. That's been argued by Daniel Peterson before. I show it further. And so the idea of a priest-king, that's biblical, that's Melchizedek. And then, so I got another thought on that, but I'm forgetting what it was. So yeah.
I think it's I think it's important too because it raises an interesting tension that you and I discussed briefly as we were preparing for this little chat, and that's that on the one hand, there's something that strongly echoes the Josian reform in the story of the Book of Mormon, the emergence of the Book of the Plates, the discovery of the plates, the translation, all that, like the whole project of the Book of Mormon and what it's intended to do. On the other hand, the Book of Mormon also seems to actually contain a narrative that in many ways is anti-Josian, which is to say anti-Deuteronomist, right? I mean, it's like a key part of the Josian reform, for example, dealt with the not just the priesthood of Aaron or the Levitical priesthood and sort of like exclusive lineages for authorizing temple rituals and stuff like that, but also just the primacy of the temple as the only place where certain things could happen, the primacy of Jerusalem. And one of the first things they do, I mean, before they even they go into the desert in Nephi's account, they go into the desert and start and build a shrine and start performing sacrifices before they know they're leaving permanently.
Right.
So they're doing things that really fly in the face of certain Josian principles and reforms and stuff, while at the same time also doing something that kind of is intrinsically Josian.
Right. That is a really complex, fascinating relationship. So that comes out the most in my chapter 14. The book has 15 chapters. Chapter 14, I consider the crescendo of the book, and I consider the story there to have been the crescendo of the lost manuscript. And I titled that chapter The Mosiah Reform. It's about the narrative of the first Mosiah, not the more familiar one in the extant text after the small plates, but the one we're just given a thumbnail sketch in the book of Omni of his reign, King Benjamin's dad, Mosiah the First. He was so cool. His narrative is absolutely fascinating. The way that it echoes so many biblical patterns and brings the various threads together. The way that his narrative anticipates what we think of as Nauvoo Mormonism, and anticipates Joseph Smith, and so on. It's absolutely fascinating. I just remember the other context in which I was going to place the Nephite or Lehite performance of sacrifices right at the start of the book is going back to the original setting for the beginning of the narrative. Going to 1 Nephi, chapter 1, verse 4, where we know from that the Babylonians had just come in to Jerusalem. They'd taken away the previous king. That's not all they took away. They also plundered the temple, and the biblical record says they took all of the temple vessels or relics that were made of gold.
Which means they took the ark.
The Ark of the Covenant is gold. It's not mentioned after this. It's presumably taken at this point, almost certainly. And what was the Ark? What did the Ark represent? The Ark was the presence of God. It's where the presence of God resided in the temple. You don't have the Ark. You don't have God. You have the shell of the temple, but you have God's house. You just don't have the resident. He's not there anymore. And so later in the Book of Mormon, you have the theme that God withdraws from a temple that's been made unholy. King Benjamin teaches this, and there's other places in the Book of Mormon. And then that temple gets destroyed. Well, Exhibit A for that is the Jerusalem temple. So when Lehi and his family are going out into the wilderness, and they're presuming to offer their own sacrifices outside of the temple and so on, one of the contexts in which to look at that is there's an apparent rejection by them of the Jerusalem temple.
It doesn't really exist anymore.
It doesn't really exist anymore. The shell is still there, but the substance is gone.
It'd be like people performing their own endowments because the government comes in and takes over the temples and takes the veils down and essentially turns them into just pretty buildings.
Yeah.
Okay. A question, then why I'm asking.
Okay.
Question, why do Mormons love Jews so much? And maybe some context for why I'm asking it. There weren't that many Jews in America
No.
during Joseph Smith's lifetime.
Right.
I mean, I heard that he met that one traveling Jew once.
Who turned out to be a fake traveling.
No kidding. And European religion has a really strong history of anti-Semitism, like brutally strong.
Yeah.
And so, but Mormons, we feel this enamorment of Jews. And why? I mean, I love it.
Yeah.
You know, it's like kind of the coolest, funnest part in a lot of ways, but why? Like,
So,
what is this
right.
coming from?
Yeah. So growing up Mormon, I've always had a prejudice when it comes to Jews. I love them.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm like totally philo-Semitic,
Yeah.
right? Like that's my prejudice.
I say
Jews,
I
they're
trust poets
fantastic.
and Jews. That's basically
What?
like my authority. I trust poets and Jews as the authorities. You know? Yeah.
I'm an anthropologist by trade or by training, and I have a good friend of mine is also a Mormon anthropologist who studied in Southern California at a university there, and every year there's a conference. The American Anthropological Association does a conference, and thousands of anthropologists gather, and it's.
My question was for Don.
I know. I'm telling you a funny story, though. You're going to appreciate it, I promise. And every year, the Mormon anthropologists who are members of the association, we get a conference room. We have to meet really, really early in the morning because it's hard to actually get the rooms. I wasn't there this year, but my friend told me about it. So it's like 5 in the morning, and Mormon anthropologists get together and talk Mormonism and anthropology or whatever, and maybe do some informal presentations to each other. Well, my friend had been out the night before with one of his colleagues who's a Jewish anthropologist, who's not only Jewish but studies Judaism, so he's he's an anthropologist of Judaism. And I'm not going to say the guy's name, but my Mormon friend had been his designated driver. Okay, so they went out the night before, and he'd gotten pretty hammered, and then my friend drove him back to the hotel, and he was really, really hammered. And my friend didn't really even get much sleep because he had to be there the next morning for this early meeting of Mormons. So he's in there with his fellow Mormons, and his buddy walks in, and he's still drunk. And so his Jewish friend walks in, and he's really hammered, and he sits down next to him and starts kind of talking loud, like just cross talk, and he's talking way too loud. And he's kind of acting drunk, and my friend says, "You can't do this here right now. These people are Mormons." And the guy says, "Oh, Mormons are fine. They think they're Jews anyway."
Yeah.
True story.
I mean, that was a good story. Sounds like sure.
So yeah, it's a fascinating question, and I'm sure there are a number of threads to the answer. I can think of a couple offhand. So for one thing, I mean, there's actually an author who also published with Koford Books, who's coincidentally named Bradley Kramer. Who's
not me.
Really?
Yeah.
Who has written about
Possibly have to
how.
clarify that. It's the non-cussing Brad.
Yes. Bradley is emphatically the not cussing Bradley.
Does that make him more Jewish or less Jewish? So, in his book, he points out how the Book of Mormon actually tends to counter the anti-Semitic elements of the New Testament. And Christian anti-Semitism, it's long been argued, is in some ways rooted in the New Testament.
The actual New Testament.
And because the Book of Mormon, it has so much more. There are places where it's really blaming the Jews for things and so on, but relative to the New Testament, it's actually remarkably positive.
It's less anti-Semitic for sure.
Yeah. And less anti-Semitic, also, and these are maybe independent things in a way, more philo-Semitic, right? It loves the Jews. And it says, like, Nephi's like, I'm a Jew, I understand Jews, I love Jews, I want to save the Jews, right? So there's this very strong Jewish consciousness in the text. I would, another possibility for one of the, and I mentioned how Judaic the Book of Mormon itself is, but another factor probably is while we think of the lost pages as just having been lost and therefore kind of irrelevant to what happens later in Mormon history, people are not reading the lost pages, later converts to the church, they're not reading that material. But you know who did? Only the founders of the faith, most particularly Joseph Smith, encountered that material at the very start. He would have been lastingly shaped by that encounter, and we can actually see that sometimes when some of these themes from the lost pages pop up in Nauvoo. So the early Book of Mormon text is even more Judaic than our present text. You've got Joseph, Emma, Martin, and others encountering the more Judaic form of the text and leaving a lasting impression on them. And then, which I let in my thesis, there's like a larger context where the Book of Mormon, and particularly the lost part of the Book of Mormon, is being interpreted by the early Mormons in light of contemporaneous movements. So there was a movement that, in my thesis, I termed, or set of movements, really, American Proto-Zionism. It was an effort to gather the Jews to colonies in the United States. And what Joseph Smith is doing, like at this point, what he sees himself doing fits hand in glove. He's trying to gather the Jews and the Native Americans to an American New Jerusalem, right?
And these were like literal Jews. This is not
literal
like
Jews.
Anglo-Israelitism where
white
people are calling themselves Jews.
Right. These are literal Jews. And there's been research on Jews in this part of New York. So, Rochester is one of the near cities. It's like 20 miles away or something to Palmyra. The first people with recognizably Jewish surnames show up in Rochester on the 1840 census. Joseph Smith probably never met a Jew in his life at the time that he's doing all this. He has encountered Jews in the newspaper, and that becomes really significant. That's what's shaping his early understanding. He's encountering American proto-Zionist movements through the newspaper, for one thing. And then, because the early Latter-day Saints become sort of, in their way, kind of like Anglo-Israelites. They're laying claim to Israelite identity.
Not Jewish, but Israelite.
That helps them to gain a sense of kinship with the Jews. The Jews aren't an alien group. They're our cousins, man.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, could I also ask, do you think the esotericism, that's strange? Because European esotericists, they like Jews, right?
Oh, yeah.
Do you think that element of Mormonism links into it, okay?
Sure, yeah. So the esotericism of Mormonism is there from the start, from the 1820s. So no doubt that would have an impact. In the back?
Yeah, one question that, I don't know if it ties back into your, when you're talking about the Sword of Laban, but a lot of people that are Mormon scholars that are interested in looking at the Book of Mormon, its history, and trying to find a geography for it, talk a lot about, well, as soon as they got over to the New World, it wasn't really like virgin land, like it kind of seems like.
Yeah.
But there was a bunch of people there already, and they must have encountered them, right?
Right.
And they'll look at a couple textual evidences for that.
Yeah.
But a main part of the argument is, well, we don't have that first chunk of the Book of Mormon that might have said something about that.
Yeah.
So we'll never know.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if any of your studies, whether in the book or out of the book, has anything to say, whether to disabuse people of that or to support that.
So I did a podcast with Sunstone. I did 2 episodes just in the last couple of weeks that will be coming out soon. Jackson Washburn, the host, asked me questions about this. So you'll be able to find a little fuller answer there. But I didn't directly go into this in the book because I'm actually trying to really avoid historical issues in the book. The book assumes a framework of like there really were Nephites, Mormons, a real voice, and so on. It assumes that in how I present the material. I tried not to assume that in making arguments about what was in the last manuscript, because I want everybody to be able to read this, whatever they think of the Book of Mormon, wherever they think it's from, and agree that this is reconstructing that lost manuscript, not trying to get behind the manuscript, but just get at the manuscript, right? So, however, I'll say it's occurred to me that this actually intersects what I've pieced together here from the last pages, intersects with that Book of Mormon historicity discussion of what are called others in a couple ways. So, on the one hand, 3 ways. 2 ways, really. The first way that I'll say, it's not really a way that it intersects. It's to say it doesn't, in some sense, it doesn't intersect. Nothing that I found seems to say anything about others in the land. I don't see any evidence that was in the lost narratives. If more evidence pops up for what was in the lost narratives and that's in there, great. Yeah. The 2 ways that I do see it intersecting actually kind of go in opposite directions. One way that it intersects is it might actually seem to give evidence against others in the land being presumed by the text, because when there's actually a story about the Mulekites that was given by Emer Harris, Martin's brother, where it looks like his narrative that he's giving from the lost pages of the Mulekites is echoing the biblical story of Noah. So he actually describes that there were 4 men and 4 women who founded this colony, the Mulekite nation. Well, 4 men and 4 women on a boat. That should sound familiar. That's Noah and the ark. And a potential reason that these people might have been framed as Noah and his family is if they came to the new land and it was empty, like the Jaredites had killed themselves off and there's just an empty land, that would be like the post-flood world, right? And then also, just like in the Book of Mormon, in the Lost Pages narrative about what I'm calling Nephi's conquest, there doesn't seem to have been a mention there of other people. It's, let me take a step back. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me say it this way. Read chapter 10. And about the Jaredites as giants and the Lamanites as the Book of Mormon's Canaanites. And it seems to have implications that might at least imply that the land's basically empty, or at the very least that the Nephites in the Lost Pages are ignoring others in the land just like they do in the extant text. The last thing I'll say about that, though, is that the fact that the Nephites, we can show from this evidence for the Lost Pages that the Nephites considered the Lamanites to be Canaanites, it would fit really, really well with a theory that there were others and the Lamanites intermarried with those others. Because why else would you identify Israelites as Canaanites? Laman and Lemuel are Israelites just as much as Nephi, and yet their family gets cast as the Book of Mormon's cursed Canaanites, not its blessed Israelites. So the whole idea of a curse intersects with the biblical narrative there and could connect with the discussion of others. So
I think we should wrap it. Thank you, Don. If you brought copies of the book, make sure you have Don sign it. If you're going to get a copy up front, make sure you bring it back for Don to sign.